Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me as always. Continuing with recapping every single aspect of the NFL draft, setting you up for your dynasty rookie drafts, your dynasty leagues, helping you better understand these rookies and their landing spots. Tonight, we will turn our attention to the defensive side of the ball. We don't go there too often, but tonight we're talking IDP rookie rankings. You heard my takes on these guys on the recap shows the weekend of the NFL draft. You heard my takes on many of these defensive players when I did the division by division NFL draft recap shows. But now, kind of spinning this a little bit to the fantasy lens, spinning this to rookie drafts that include your IDPs, and then talking a little bit about how I would rank these guys in terms of the edge players, which will made up of the D-line and your edge rushers, the linebackers, and the defensive backs. I'll go through, share my rankings, my thoughts with these guys, and then kind of tell you how I would fit them in an overall big board. I do think one of the tricky things about IDP leagues is the scoring. Well, we know every dynasty league has different scoring settings for offense. They're all pretty close in terms of uniformity, in terms of the value of rookies. When it comes to IDP, though, it is very different. And I think that's what makes creating a overall consensus big board very single tricky. Because it could be DT premium, and sacks can be of a premium, or tackles could be extremely valuable. So there's a lot of different layers that go into making IDP rankings. So it's very hard to have a one size fits all for all the different leagues that are out there. So I think that makes it a little bit of a challenge when you're doing IDP rankings. But we'll kind of talk through it a little bit. I am going to, again, for anybody watching on YouTube, I am going to share the screen from the S2S Premium Rankings notebook, just where my IDP rookie rankings are right now. So you should be seeing that on the screen as well. So let's kind of jump right into it here a little bit and get started here with the defensive line / edge group. And again, that's the big distinction, right? It depends on what site you're using. A lot of the sites now, especially MFL, have started to integrate the edge rushers. We know so many guys who are deemed 3-4 edge rushers based on depth charts. Used to be classified as linebackers, and then it really devalued them in fantasy. And now there's been a change that those guys are being more classified with the other edge rushers and the other defensive linemen. So I think that makes for a more appropriate valuing in that regard. So let's start right there. Let's start with the D-line and the edge rushing group. And Will Anderson kind of sits atop there in his own tier. Will Anderson Jr. out of Houston, obviously third pick in the NFL draft. The premier defensive player in this class. I have been on record, though, says I don't think he's on the level of a Myles Garrett, on a Nick or Joey Bosa. He's just not that kind of player. When I look at Will Anderson, I think he's going to be more, he doesn't have that elite get off, that elite bend off the edge. He's very good with his hand usage. He plays with power. There's a lot to like about Will Anderson, but I look at Will Anderson, I think he's a 10 to 12 sack kind of guy, not a 14 to 16 kind of sack upside guy. I just don't see that. But in this IDP class, he's the clear top player at the IDP position from this rookie class. Next up for me would be Tyree Wilson, who was picked up by the Raiders at pick 7 overall. And then Jalen Carter, who went 9 to the Philadelphia Eagles. I'll group those two guys together. They would make up a tier for me. For me, it would be Tyree Wilson and Jalen Carter. If you were in a DT premium league, then Jalen Carter, might even kick to the top of this list, to be frankly honest with you, because we're talking about a guy who his upside is, to be able to wreck games literally like Warren Sapp once upon a time did, right? He's got the skill set where he can play with power. He can play with speed. He's athletic. He has good hand technique. For him, it's the other stuff, right? Does he have the want to? Is football his focus? Is the off the field stuff going to stay off the field and not impact what we see on the football field? But in that team, on that D-line. They're going to send waves of players. Maybe this year he's a little bit more of a rotation, but, by year 2, year 3, you could see him turn to a flat-out superstar if his focus is on football. So really high ceiling there. Tyree Wilson, he's going to get every opportunity there. He fits, if you think about like the prototypical New England Patriots edge players over the years, and then so much of a Raiders influence, Patriots influence now with the Raiders, it makes sense that they went Tyree Wilson. The Patriots have had a lot of success with guys like that. So if you think about it, if you think about different guys that have had success for the Patriots, you could see Tyree Wilson kind of playing that role, whether he's more of a traditional defensive end or where he's a 3-4-5 tack or they stand him up, right? A lot of different things they could do with him to maximize his skill set. He's going to get a lot of opportunity right off the bat. So for me, it's Will Anderson, tier 1. Tier 2 would be my second, third ranked D-line edge players, and that would be Tyree Wilson out of from Las Vegas and Jalen Carter from Philadelphia. After that, I think it starts to get a lot more clustered, and there's a lot of different way you can rank from number 4, I would say, all the way to almost probably number 9. I think 4 through 9 really can be ranked in any particular way. For me, it's kind of like that big wide receiver group where you get to the Jaden Reed, Rashee Rice, Jalen Hyatt, Josh Downs, Cedric Tillman, Tank Dell. And it's kind of like pick your favorite, one that you want and rank them anyway. I kind of look at that for this section here. From 4 through 9, I do think you can rank them in any way you want and make a strong argument. For me, at number 4, I have Nolan Smith, drafted by the Eagles. He fell to pick 30. I honestly think that if Jalen Carter were to win the top 9, that Nolan Smith might have been the 10th pick in the draft. Does that change what his IDP would have been? Maybe. But, to me, he's the same type of guy. They have a guy who plays just like Nolan Smith and Hassan Reddick. I think Nolan Smith could be a better version of that. Not this year, obviously, but I think he plays the run better than Hassan Reddick. He's got the same type of get-off as a guy like Hassan Reddick. And again, he's not going to be able to be a focal point of that Eagles defense based on how loaded they are. That I think Nolan Smith is set up to really make an impact in year 2 and beyond. I would expect a big impact in terms of IDP and fantasy in year 1, but I like the upside of him higher than any of the other guys in this big tier from 4 to 9 here. So that's where Nolan Smith sits atop that for me. After that is Will McDonald, the 4th, who was drafted by the Jets at pick 15. I think Will McDonald, if we look back at this draft class and in 5 years we say who's had the most sacks of anybody in this draft class, I do think Will McDonald, if I wasn't going to pick Will Anderson Jr., Will McDonald would probably be the guy that I picked because he has the best first step explosiveness and bend off the edge of any pass rusher in this class. Are there questions about whether or not he could, be a 3-down player, hold up against the run? Yeah, there's some legitimate concerns there. But in terms of this best pure speed off the edge, that's Will McDonald. To me, it's Will McDonald and Nolan Smith. They're the best 2 in the class. So the Jets go with Will McDonald. And I think Nolan Smith, Will McDonald, very similar in terms of upside. I have Nolan Smith slightly ahead because of the Eagles. I just think the team that they have built it there would take some of the focus off of him if he turned into a premier pass rusher. And 2, I like the talent a little bit more. And I think he's a little bit better against the run than Will McDonald, so he could pick up some more of those, tackles along the way. But I do think they're both guys that have 10 to 12 sack potential based on their explosiveness off the edge. So for me, it's Nolan Smith and Will McDonald. Other people would have the next guy, and that was Lucas Van Ness, who got drafted by the Packers. I like Lucas Van Ness, athletic, very versatile player. I'm just not sure for fantasy, he's a guy that has 10 sack upside. I think he's going to have to make his hay in fantasy as a guy who maybe gets 7 to 8 sacks, plays the run well, gets tackles, this and that. I just don't think he has the ceiling of some of these other guys. But he has the draft capital. He's got the strength, he's got the power, he's got the athleticism, he's got the length. Green Bay has done a good job there with power pass rushers. So he's set up in an environment that should see him succeed. But I think there's definitely refinement and development needed for him. And I don't think he has that 10 to 12 sack upside of guys like Nolan Smith and Will McDonald. Next up in this tier, number 7 overall, the D-line edge is Perdichizzi. Listen, he might not be Aaron Donald, but he might be 75% of Aaron Donald, or he might be Grady Jarrett, right? Like, and Grady Jarrett had some really good fantasy years. I think Perdichizzi is the best interior pass rusher in this draft class. It's going to be interesting to kind of see how they use him, because I think right now on their depth chart, he's classified as a defensive end because they have Vita Vea, they brought over Gaines. So it'll be interesting because I think he's at his best. If he's lining up as a defensive end, I think that's going to take away from his strength, and that is beating interior offensive linemen with his speed and his quickness. So I think where Kancey's going to make his hay is when in sub packages, if he is on the inside, his first step explosiveness to get into the backfield and be a disruptor is what I like. I look at a guy like Perdichizzi, and I think that he could have more sack upside than Lucas Van Ness. I don't think he's going to have the tackle numbers maybe as Lucas Van Ness will, but I think Kancey has a higher ceiling than Van Ness, but I think the floor is a little bit lower because he is a little bit of an outlier, right? We're betting that he's another guy who could, be a dominant pass rushing interior defensive tackle at like 282 pounds. So that's why I put him after Lucas Van Ness. But I really like Perdichizzi. I thought he was a top 10, top 15 player in this class. The Bucs took him at 19. I think he's going to be an upfield penetrator and disruptor. So I have him a little higher than you probably see on other ranks, because I think he does have 8 to 10 or maybe even 11 sack upside, which is a lot of what these, I think, traditional, more defensive end or edge rushers have. I think Kancey can get there as well, and then also be, a disruptor against the run due to his athleticism, speed, and quickness. So that's why I had him a little bit higher than you're going to see in other IDP ranks. And number 8, I have Felix Uzama, who went to Kansas City. Listen, I think Kansas City wanted Will McDonald or wanted Nolan Smith. They wanted that speed off the edge. Unduke Uzama gives you some of that speed off the edge, but he's very strong, powerful. He's like 262. So he's got some speed and bend off the edge, but he's also a little bit more powerful. And in terms of his play strength, power, and physicality, and a guy like Nolan Smith or Will McDonald, he just doesn't have that elite get off, that elite first step bend and explosion off the outside. But we've seen guys be very, very productive there in that Kansas City scheme. The pass rushers get a chance to get after the quarterback a lot due to the productivity of the Kansas City offense. So I think Unduke Uzama is going to get a real chance there. That, there were a lot of teams calling to try to get to the end of that first round pick. They didn't want to make the trade. They kept the pick. They had targeted him once McDonald and Nolan Smith were off the board. So I think he's got a real chance to be an impactful player there out of the gate. I just think his ceiling is probably capped similar to like a guy like Lucas Van Ness. I think he's maybe an 8 to 10 sack type of player. Play to run well is also. Next up at number 9 is Myles Murphy. Only reason why he's at the end of this here for me is the Bengals are pretty crowded in terms of their pass rusher group. I just don't know the volume he's going to play right off the bat, which could hurt his sack opportunities, or more importantly, maybe hurt his tackle opportunities. Very good athlete, still some development and refinement from the technical side of things. He's got to, develop and increase his pass rush repertoire in terms of, pass rush techniques. And he's in a little bit of a crowded, pass rushing there. That's probably going to be a rotation, and he's going to get every opportunity. And they love those bigger pass rushers like Carlos Dunlaps of the world and stuff like that. So I think it makes a lot of sense. But again, first round draft capital for all those guys. I think their leash is a little bit longer. I think their opportunity to be starters is quicker when you're a first round pick. So I kind of have that tier. It's pretty spread out there from 4 to 9, but I don't think there should be a lot of gap in the drafting of these guys. And that's one of the things, and I'll talk about the next tier in a second, but I do think the IDP draft that I've already taken part of, that's mixed in with the offensive rookies as well, I'm surprised at how much separation there is between some of the rookies, right? Will Anderson goes off like in the second round, and then like a round or a round and a half later, you start seeing some of these next pass rushers, right? Like Tyree Wilson or maybe Jalen Carter. And then another round after that, you start to see like, Will McDonald and Lucas Van Ness and all these other guys. And then even rounds after that, you see, Perdichizzi and Unduke Uzama, a wide spread out. Like in the draft that I was in, I ended up getting Nolan Smith, and I believe it was in the 4th round. and him and Will McDonald went early or mid 4th round, and then Nduke Uzuma went in the 6th round. Like, to me, there shouldn't be this separation from these guys. These guys all should be taken within 8, 10, 12 picks of each other, I think, a round of each other, because they are all very similar players. But when other people are drafting other positions, things kind of start to spread out a little bit. And I think that's something where you could take advantage of the guys that are falling. If we make up the next tier, and I'll go through this tier, talk about it a little bit, and then just run off the rest of the guys on my list. In this tier, number 10 overall in my D-line edge rankings is Derek Hall out of Seattle, BJ Ojulari out of Arizona, Keon White out of New England, Isaiah Foskey to the Saints, Brian Breesy to the Saints, would be kind of where I cut that off. For these guys, they're all 2nd round draft capital, except Breesy. Brian Breesy went in the 1st round, but Brian Breesy is a little bit more defensive tackle, and I don't think he's got the pass rush upside or repertoire of Kalijah Kancey, so that's why he's a little bit down in this tier for me. The other guys, though, Hall, Ojulari, White, Foskey, to me, they're all very comparable players. I'm surprised that I'm seeing separation in their value, and honestly, I don't think these guys are all that far off from the previous tier of the Nolan Smiths and the Will McDonalds and the Van Ness and those guys, the Miles Murphy. The only difference is these guys have a little bit lesser draft capital, and their talent might be a little bit less, but it's small, right? Nduke Uzuma went in round 1, Miles Murphy went in round 1. They could have easily went to the top of the early portion of round 2, where we saw Derek Hall go, we saw BJ Ojulari go, we saw Keon White and Isaiah Foskey. All of these guys went in the top half of round 2. All the teams were aggressive in wanting these players. None of them let them slip. None of them pivoted to the offensive side of the ball. I think all of these guys, Hall, Ojulari, White, and Foskey, should all be drafted pretty close to each other in range. And to be honest with you, I don't think they're all that far off. Like I said, the round 1 guys, the Murphys, the Uzuma, the Kancey, the Lucas Van Ness, those guys. Like, I prefer Will McDonald and Nolan Smith clearly over these guys, but I think these guys are not that far away. And I'm surprised the separation in rankings, the separation in ADP data for the rookies, or just what I'm seeing in rookie drafts as well. You can go through, right? Derek Hall, explosiveness, very Carl Lawson type player. BJ Ojulari, one of the best for the day 2 guys. Really good pass rusher, really good technical side of it, good pass rush techniques. Keon White, you look at a guy like the Patriots, they look at him, I think, and they're going to think of a guy like Chandler Jones. They could do a lot with a guy like Keon White. He's going to be versatile, all different spots along the D-line, stand them up, defensive end, kick them inside defensive tackle. I think you're going to get the best out of Keon White, who's still a little bit unrefined, former tight end at Old Dominion, a journey to be where he is. And Isaiah Foskey, the Saints were aggressive in picking him, even though they just had taken Brian Breesy in the 1st round. They double dipped, to add to that defensive line. So I think all those guys really similar in talent level. After that, to me, it's a little bit of a drop down. So number 15 for me is Tuipulotu, went to the Chargers. Versatile player. Will be interesting to kind of see how they envision using him. More edge, D-line, defensive end, how they use, but he does have a versatile skill set. I just didn't think the talent was as high as the guys in the previous tier. Brian Young, who went to the Rams from Tennessee. This guy's an explosive pass rusher off the edge. He's a little bit of an older prospect. That's why he fell to the 3rd round draft and not the 2nd round. Hall group. Then you get to some really explosive defensive tackles. Number 17 for me is Keanu Benton, and number 18 is Maze Smith to the Cowboys. Both of these guys, I think Benton's had more sack production, so that's why I put him there. Maze Smith, I think, is a little bit more of upside and potential. We haven't seen him put it together, but he was on Bruce Feldman's. He was number 1 on Bruce Feldman's freak list. So I think there's some upside and untapped potential there. If you're talking DT premium leagues, these guys get big jumps up there. Same thing with Brian Breesy. Obviously, I already talked about Jalen Carter. If any of these other guys got DT designation, and you're in a DT premium league, they also increase a little bit in value. And then Yaya Diaby at 19, Tommy Adebawore, 20, DJ Johnson, 21 to the Panthers, 22, Zach Harrison, Falcons, 23, Colby Wooden of the Packers, 24 and 25, Two of the Bears defensive tackle picks in round 2, Zach Pickens at 24, Gervin Dexter at 25. So that is my D-line edge group. Again, I think the depth is good. I think the top end elite level talent is pretty much just Will Anderson, and I don't even think he is in that super elite tier, but I think he's in the tier of his own. Then I think Wilson and Jalen Carter. Then there's that big tier of the other guys from round 1, and then another big tier who make up those day 2 guys. But I think it's good depth. I think the depth of it is really strong. The fact that in the 6th round of a mixed offense and defense rookie draft, you can find guys like Foskey and Keon White and stuff like that. Like, I think those are good value picks. It's just there was a lot of them. It just didn't maybe lack the star power at the top in terms of dominant fantasy IDP production. But I think there's a lot of intriguing players here in that D-line edge classification. If we take this over to the linebackers, top of the list, clearly Jack Campbell. He's in a tier of his own. He was the best pure linebacker in this draft. He's got the highest tackle production. I think the Lions, he's going to get right there and be the leader of that defense. So for me, Jack Campbell is far and away in a tier of his own. Him and Will Anderson are the top 2 IDP rookies by far in this draft. I would say both of them, should go somewhere either, I'd probably even take Campbell ahead of Will Anderson. I'd say late round 1 to early round 2 for Jack Campbell in leagues that linebackers score well. Then Will Anderson. To me, those are clearly the top 2 guys. After that, I think I would take the rest of my top 28 in terms of the offensive skill players, because I've said it's a big drop off a cliff after pick 28 to me in Superflex rookie rankings on the offensive side. The only 2 guys that would stretch out into my top 30 would be Jack Campbell and Will Anderson. Then I would start mixing in the other D-line guys and then some of the other linebackers here. So for me, my next group of linebackers, and this is going to go against the grain, but I really do think almost in a tier should be Drew Sanders, who went to the Broncos, Deion Henley, who went to the Chargers, Trenton Simpson, who went to the Ravens, Dorian Williams, who went to the Bills, and DeMarvion Overshown, who went to the Cowboys. All of them, every one of them was taken in the 3rd round. I don't really care what the pre-draft narrative was. And I think too many times we focus on the pre-draft narrative post-draft. The NFL said that they didn't look at Drew Sanders as a 1st-round pick. So it doesn't matter that mock drafts did. He went the entire 2nd round without being picked. He went like a handful of picks into the 3rd round without being picked. If the NFL thought this was a late 1st-round talent, he would have went somewhere on round 2. He would not have fallen into the early portion of round 3. Same thing for Trenton Simpson. Baltimore took him late in round 3. It doesn't matter anymore that pre-draft narrative. Some people had him in the late round 1 mocks or early round 2 mocks. Doesn't matter. What matters now is that he was drafted late in round 3. He's not going to start right out of the gate. He's right there with Dorian Williams and DeMarvion Overshown and Deion Henley. If you were doing your homework, all of these guys were projected to go on day 2. Every one of them. So I don't know why there's so much disparity in rankings when you look at IDP rankings, when you look at blended rankings, when you look at rookie drafts, and you see Dorian Williams and DeMarvion Overshown going a round or a round and a half or 2 rounds after maybe Drew Sanders or some of these other players. To me, there's not much separation. You can make the case that Dorian Williams could be the 2nd or 3rd linebacker ranked. I went with Drew Sanders because I think he has the highest sack potential here because he was recruited to Alabama as a 5-star recruit as an edge. They finally got his opportunity when he transferred to Arkansas, and he got after the quarterback this year, and he was tremendous. So he might be a little bit of a hybrid player. I'm not saying he's a skill set of Micah Parsons, but used similarly to how Dallas used Micah Parsons last year. So that's why Sanders is number 2 for me. It has nothing to do with pre-draft narrative. He's got the most intriguing fantasy skill set. But his draft capital does not separate him from these other guys. If anything, it should put him in a big tier with these other guys. Deion Henley, I loved him as a player, but he should not be clearly going further ahead than Dorian Williams and DeMarvion Overshown. Dorian Williams might get every opportunity to replace Tremaine Edmonds and be an impact player this year. He's athletic. He's got range. Same thing can be said about DeMarvion Overshown and Trenton Simpson. But Trenton Simpson's even a little bit refined and stuff. So I think this tier should be from 2 to 6. Drew Sanders to DeMarvion Overshown and all these other guys in between. I have it Sanders, Henley, Simpson, Williams, and Overshown, but I think you can mix it up and it's not crazy. And to be honest with you, I probably wouldn't invest because I like 28 offensive guys so much. I probably was never going to get an opportunity to get a guy like Drew Sanders or Deion Henley. But I would have an opportunity for guys like Dorian Williams and DeMarvion Overshown because I don't think they should be going that much further after. So once I see guys like Sanders and Henley going, I think I could wait 8 to 10 picks, but other people think they can probably wait 12, 14, 16, 18 picks. I think they should be closer together. So that's my second tier there. Sanders, Henley, Simpson, Dorian Williams, DeMarvion Overshown. I really like Dorian Williams. He's an X factor. If you tell me you want to put him at number 3 on this list of linebackers, I can totally buy it. I think you could even make the case he could be number 2, to be frankly honest with you, with the opportunity there that awaits for him in Buffalo. Next up for me, almost in his own tier, because I don't really know what to do with him, is Marte Mapu to the Patriots. A lot of people play on MFL. Right now in MFL, he's classified as a safety. He's only 218 pounds. When the Patriots drafted him, they announced him as a linebacker. He's on their depth chart as a linebacker. But right now, MFL has not made that adjustment. So he's in a weird place. If he was 100% guaranteed to be a linebacker, I think he almost goes at the end of the previous tier after over. Back. This is a guy that Daniel Jeremiah, arguably the best draft evaluator out there in terms of the NFL, in terms of what we see in terms of the media, had him in the I think 75th on his big board. He wasn't surprised when he was taken. He liked his player. He said he was his favorite player to watch on film. The Patriots obviously liked him. The Patriots have went small school prospects like Kyle Duggar and turned them into really impactful fantasy players. So I think they have plans for Mapu. He's really athletic. If he tested out pre-draft, he probably would have been beloved by more people in the community and the industry. I'm not going to say he would have went higher. He already went really high for an off-the-ball linebacker. But right now, the uncertainty about position in terms of position designation for fantasy is why he for Connor here. After that, I kind of don't really love any of the other linebackers. I think depending on how deep your league is, maybe there's 1 or 2 more names to stash. Henry To'oTo'o, who went to the Texans. A lot of people thought he was going to get picked earlier. He's maybe a guy who could be that 5th-round linebacker, and just his instincts, his techniques, his play recognition, could that supersede the athletic limitations? And could he rise up the depth chart? Yeah, he's worth a stab. I think in rookie drafts where you draft IDP. And Owen Powell to the Arizona, same idea. Even if you want to say Servakia Dennis, I kind of get it. But these are guys that it all depends on how deep you are, what type of squad guys is. At 11, who went to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Dula at 12, who went to Jacksonville. Who went to the Bears at 13. D. Winters, San Francisco at 14. Ventrell Miller, 15 for me. Went to the Jaguars. Zaire Barnes at 16. And then Jalen Graham to the 49ers is 17. Of that list, I'm most intrigued by Nick Herbig. It's really interesting to see how they use him, right? Because I think he was at his best in college as a pass rusher. So how he fits in there and can he make the full-time transition to off-the-ball linebacker? It's going to be interesting. A hybrid player. So To'oTo'o, Papo, Dennis, and Herbig would be 4 guys that I think are draftable in deep leagues. And then the rest of the guys you're watching or waiver wire. If we take this to the defense, me, 4 players are maybe draftable. And that's Brian Branch, who went to the Lions in the early portion of round 2, Sidney Brown, who went to the Eagles on day 2, Jordan Battle, who went to the Bengals on day 2, and then Jair Brown, who went to the 49ers on day 2. I think those 4 guys, to me, Branch is kind of Jair Brown are in that next tier. I just think circles. I think Brian Branch could be that type of player. But defensive backs are usually the least valuable of all the IDP spots. So I think he would still go pretty far in drafts. Again, it all depends on your settings and stuff. But I think Brian Branch, would be the clear first defensive back taken. And then I think Sidney Brown, Jordan Battle, and Jair Brown. I would prefer Sidney Brown first, and then Jordan Battle, Jair Brown a little bit later. But I think you can make an argument to mix and match those guys. But those are the 4 guys that I think deserve to be drafted. After that, it really depends on league set, and do you have to start 2 corners on Martin? I think he's another versatile player, similar to Brian Lynch. So he might be one more guy who's draftable because he's got that versatility. Then after that, you're talking about taking a stab on day 3 safeties who fell and could be a fantasy viable player, but does he ever get an opportunity as a 5th round pick? Chris Smith, another 5th round pick to the Raiders. Does he get an opportunity? And then you start talking about some of these cornerbacks. And I look for the cornerback position, those guys who are not afraid to play the run, tough, physical. I think Devin Witherspoon clearly in his own tier in terms of the cornerbacks, but then Deonte Banks and Joey Porter right behind them. Those guys are not afraid to mix it up. They're physical press style corners. So I think in terms of cornerbacks, Witherspoon, Banks, and Porter Jr. would be my top 3, followed by Julius Brents, very physical, very athletic, who went on day 2. Those would be my top 4 rankings. And then I finish it out with some more cornerbacks like Christian Gonzalez, who went to the Patriots. I don't think he's going to do much in the tackle, so he'd really have to be about ball production. Same thing with Emmanuel Forbes. Again, not going to be a guy who gets a lot of tackles, but DJ Turner, who went to the Bengals, Riley Moss, who went to the Broncos, Tyreek Stevenson, who went to the Bears at 16, Kaylee Ringo, 17, went to the Eagles, 18, Cam Smith to Miami, 19, Garrett Williams to Arizona, and then 20, Anthony Johnson Jr. of Iowa State. 7th round pick. So I don't like having too high rankings, but there is an opening there in Green Bay if they don't re-sign a guy like a veteran like Adrian Amos back. So keep an eye on Anthony Johnson Jr. just in case he gets an opportunity there. There are some people who do like him, but I think in terms of DBs, if it's a league that you have cornerbacks and safeties mixed together in terms of defensive backs, I only think about 4 or 5 should be drafted. And then maybe if the cornerbacks are included, it stretches out to, maybe 9, 10 guys, because there are some intriguing cornerbacks that are physical, tough, and play to run well that I think would have some value in that setting. So there it is, guys. My D-line edge, my linebacker group, and my defensive back group. If we were going to start talking about where some of these IDP guys would be situated in my overall big board, let me bring on my overall big board here. Again, this is just the offensive side of it, but let me kind of talk about it here. Like, I look at my big board here, and I wouldn't even start considering, for me, I wouldn't start considering any of the IDP guys for me with the first 15 picks. I think the upside of even guys like Devin A-Chain, Jaden Reed, Kendra Miller, and Zach Charbonnet supersede, what Jack Campbell and Will Anderson can bring. If it's a really heavy IDP scoring, I can maybe say after Jonathan Mingo at 11, then maybe I would slide in Jack Campbell there at 12, and then maybe Will Anderson at like 16. That would be a scenario that I could see based on the scoring. But for me, those are the only 2 guys that I would have in my top 28 overall big board. So Campbell, again, depending on settings, maybe 12, but the furthest would probably be 16. Will Anderson, I don't see a scenario where I'd probably have Will Anderson before like that 16, 17. So like I think Campbell could be as high as 12. If not 12, he'd be at 16. And then I think the earliest for me, including Jack Campbell, where I'd have Will Anderson would probably be 17. before we got to that run of wide receivers, the day 2 guys, Josh Downs, Jalen Hyatt, Rashee Rice, Marvin Mims. So that those would be the only 2 defensive players in my top 20 would be Campbell and Will Anderson. Then for me, I'd have to get out of this top 28. I keep talking about it. I did make a change since I did record the last pod. I moved up Tyjae Spears slightly above Tank Bigsby because in one of my drafts, that's what I did. And, once I make a decision in my own draft, I adjust my rankings, after I put them to the test. But for me, that next group of guys, and whether it's, Wilson or Jalen Carter or the other linebackers like Drew Sanders or any of those guys, I wouldn't start thinking of them until around pick 29 in my rankings. And if you add that I already would have had Will Anderson and Jack Campbell there, that means 30 names are off the board, right? So in that 31 spot would be where I would start saying, okay, 28 offensive players off the books, Will Anderson and Jack Campbell off the books. Then I think it would be very heavy defense. I would want any of those before I started drafting guys like Hendon Hooker, Chase Brown, Eric Gray. Now, Hendon Hooker's a little bit interesting, right? Obviously, if it's super flex, maybe he gets pushed up a little bit. But I wouldn't be drafting round 5 running backs like Chase Brown and Eric Gray, or tight ends who I don't think have tight end 1 ceiling like Loon Shoemaker or Darnell Washington because he's got Pat Freiermuth there, and then wide receivers like Michael Wilson, Charlie Jones, Tyler Scott. I would not be drafting any of those guys before I drafted Drew Sanders, Deion Henley, DeMarvion Overshown, Dorian Williams, any of those guys. All of those guys should be going ahead of these round 5 running backs, these tight ends, and these wide receivers that you're seeing here on my ranking in that 30 to 36 range. I would take all those off the ball linebackers. I would also take guys like Nolan Smith and Will McDonald and that group of defensive line guys, all of those guys from Lucas Van Ness to Nolan Smith to McDonald and that whole group of my guys, the other round 1 guys, from the defensive line group. Then maybe I would also mix in there. I would probably take guys like Shoemaker, Darnell Washington, Chase Brown, and Eric Gray and their upside over a defensive back. So I'd probably take those guys, Brown, Gray, Shoemaker, and Washington before I took a guy like Brian Branch. But then right after that, I would go back to the defensive side and I would take more of those edge rushers from the second round, the Ojulari, Ojulari, Derek Hall, Foskey, Keon White, add the linebacker there, Mapu. I would take all of those guys before I started veering into the wide receiver group there. You see for my offensive rankings at 34, 35, and 36. I like Michael Wilson. I like Charlie Jones. I like Tyler Scott. But I'd rather draft a defensive edge rush pass rusher who went early second round that has 8 to 10 sack upside before I took one of these wide receivers that need a lot of moving parts. And even if they get those moving parts to hit, these guys probably don't have wide receiver 3 upside. There's a tremendous amount of wide receivers in the league. So if Charlie Jones hits, he's probably a wide receiver 4-5. If Tyler Scott hits, he's probably a wide receiver 4-5. If Michael Wilson hits, he's probably a wide receiver 4-5. I think there's a much greater chance that guys like BJ Ojulari or Isaiah Foskey or Keon White being, DL2s than it is these guys ever hitting wide receiver 3 status. I'd rather have a guy who's got DL2 3 upside than a guy whose best case scenario is probably wide receiver 4-5. So that's kind of where I would rank them. I'd go through all of those, that tier of all those day 2 pass rushers I talked about before. Mapu, Sidney Brown, those guys before I took Michael Wilson, Charlie Jones, Tyler Scott, maybe not the defensive back, but definitely the pass rushers and the linebackers. Then maybe this group of Wilson, Charlie Jones, Tyler Scott, Zach Evans, Chris Rodriguez, Dwayne McBride, those guys before then. Maybe I went back to the well to take some more IDP guys. I think the IDP guys are falling too far. I think if you're taking in the second early to mid portion of round 2 of the NFL draft, I think teams are looking at these guys and a lot of these pass rushers, they think 8 to 10 sack upside. these round 3 linebackers. They think those guys could be starting caliber 3-down players. I think all of those guys are way more valuable than any of these guys, like the wide receivers like Wilson, Jones, Scott, Evans, Rodriguez, McBride, Israel Ibukanda. So for me, after those top 28 or 29 offensive players, if you want to include Hooker in there, I get it. After those top 29 offensive skill players, to me, the next big chunk to get to my top 50 would be IDP guys with Chase Brown, Eric Gray, Shoemaker, and Darnell Washington mixed in there. And then I would go Wilson, Jones, Scott, Evans, Rodriguez, McBride, and Abakanda. I just think so much has to happen for those guys like Wilson, Jones, Scott, Evans, Rodriguez, McBride, Abakanda to hit, to be an RB2, to be a wide receiver 3 at least. So much would have to happen. Not a lot has to happen for those guys to be DL2 3s. And a DL2 3 in a league where you start 2 or 3 defensive linemen, those guys are valuable starting pieces. And I just think there's a much greater chance at an early second round defensive end edge rusher becoming that than a 5th round linebacker or wide receiver becoming fantasy viable. So it would be a lot of heavy IDP. I think the depth of this rookie class is in IDP than it is. I think it's very top heavy. Like I said, 28 picks. And then I think the offensive side kind of drops off really hard. But I think then after that, the rest of the top 50, there's a lot of IDP guys. Maybe they're not top guys. And that's why only Campbell and Will Anderson would be in my top 30. But from like 31 to 50, there's a lot of IDP guys that I think are relevant. And I would have a lot of those guys with just a few offensive players mixed in if I was making a consensus big board. So, guys, this was a request of a listener. Feel free to reach out to me. I didn't create a official big board blended. If I get a chance to, I will. I'll put it in the rankings notebook. I'll tweet out an image of it as well. But feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Ask me questions. Would I rather take player X or player Y? Would I rather take BJ Ojulari or Michael Wilson? Right? I'll probably lean you towards Michael. I probably lean you towards BJ Ojulari, but some of it's dependent on your league settings or stuff like that. So reach out to me. I enjoy the interaction. I will get back to you and let you know my thoughts. Guys, if you're enjoying this content, please get over to the website, SS Football, fastest and easiest way to get there. It is still not too late to buy the 2023 premium notebooks. There's a lot of value. I am updating this rankings notebook regularly. Dynasty rookie rankings are updated almost every day. My Dynasty rookie tiers are now a part of that. My IDP rookie rankings are a part of that. If I get a chance to create that blended big board, I will create that. My positional dynasty overall rankings, I've been telling you that they've been coming. They are fully updated now. Every move from free agency, every draft. So now positional dynasty rankings are updated as of May 26th. I have 35 quarterbacks ranked. I have 61 running backs, 75 wide receivers, and 40 tight ends. So you could use that for trading in your dynasty leagues. You could use those rankings for startup dynasties. I put a lot of time and effort into making those rankings. I think you'll enjoy it if you check it out. And then obviously that's just one notebook. You get the scouting notebook, which has up over 100 detailed player profiles, scouting reports on the offensive players that were just drafted. And then you get the draft projections notebook. And while the draft is coming past a while ago now, it still has thoughts on over 400 players in there, a snapshot of who they are. So if you want a little bit more on these IDP guys, that's the perfect place to go. It gives you a quick snapshot, who they are, their size, their frame, their athleticism, their strengths, how they win, some developmental areas, to kind of help you get a better idea of who these players are and how they might translate into your fantasy leagues. So there it is, guys. Another episode in the books. Again, if you can't purchase the premium notebooks, please, wherever you listen to the podcast, rate, review, subscribe. It greatly helps us tremendously. So on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.